Okay, not to lose time, I will start already saying good morning and hello. Welcome into our workshop for B. Is governance the key in preserving biodiversity? So I hope all those that are joining right now were motivated by Tobias' talk and invitation to come to our session. So what we will have are 4 talks, starting with Professor Martin Quaas, whom I'd like to introduce to you right now. Martin is a professor of economics at the Leipzig University and leads the group on biodiversity economics at the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research in Halle-Wittenberg, Jena. Before, he has been a professor of environmental resource and ecological economics at the University of Kiel, and he's very renowned in our community. He's published more than 100 articles on the field of economics of the sustainable use and conservation of natural resources. So I'd like to overhand to you, dear Martin. For all speakers, please keep the timeline. We have 10 to 12 minutes for the talks and then a few minutes for questions, and we will have a final discussion at the end. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Now here we go. Good morning. Many thanks for the kind introduction and many thanks for attending this workshop. I do think that governance is a key, and my today's topic is the economic perspective on governance, so on economic instruments and the incentives they provide for resource managers to conserve biodiversity and natural resources. I will do this for the case of marine fisheries. The 4 key points that I hope to convey with this presentation is first that the value of natural capital and biodiversity is currently not adequately reflected in market prices. So private actors in the market economy don't face the appropriate incentives to conserve biodiversity. And correspondingly, natural capital and biodiversity are deteriorating. The point on economic instruments, and I will focus on the fisheries catch shares instrument. They help putting natural capital into value, into economic value, and accordingly set incentive for more sustainable use of biodiversity. This doesn't come without challenges, and the one particular challenge that I would like to highlight is the fair distribution of benefits from using this kind of economic instruments. Yeah, currently the value of natural capital and biodiversity is not adequately reflected in market prices. And to demonstrate this, I'm referring here to Thomas Piketty's work on the capital in 21st century. Thomas Piketty, a famous macroeconomist from Paris. He has assembled long time series data on national capital. Here the case for Germany from 1870 to 2010. National capital is measured here in percentage terms of national income. Naturally, capital is multiple times the national income for all the time. Piketty emphasizes this downward trend in capital until the mid-20th century, and then the upward trend again, and discusses the distributional concerns that come with it. I don't want to go into details now. I'm happy, of course, to enter the discussion on that if wished as well. But my key point here is the black bar down there. That's the only natural capital asset that is included in Piketty's work. That's fertile agricultural land. And you see that in the late 19th century, this type of natural capital featured prominently in the overall national capital, but importance, you see relative, of course, to national income, decreased continuously, and you see that in the 21st century, natural capital doesn't play any role in the economic market values of capital overall. So natural capital, if valued at market prices, does not play any major role in market economies nowadays. And this is correspondingly, we see now it's the global picture, it's the global fish stocks and data from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. the corresponding picture is that natural capital is deteriorating. And this example of the fisheries shows that the fraction of fish stocks that the FAO experts deem to be overfished, that has been continuously increasing since the 1970s until the most recent year of the data, 2019. Here, now about a third of the global fish stocks is deemed overfished by the experts of the FAO. Yeah, one of the reasons is that market prices do not fully reflect the social value of natural capital. That is true for fisheries, but it's true for biodiversity and natural capital more widely. And this is the key point, or one of the key points of the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, a landmark in the economics of biodiversity published 1.5 years ago, and with Sir Partha Dasgupta as the lead author, and many of you probably have heard about this report. The case Dasgupta and his co-workers make is that the market price of nature is only a small fraction of the total social value of natural capital and biodiversity, and the true social value, that is what Dasgupta calls the shadow price of biodiversity, and that's a term that we regularly use in our field, that is capturing further values of biodiversity. And taking the example of the fishery, as I want to do for my talk this morning, the market price applies to the fish once the fisherman has it, right? The catch can be landed and sold on the fish markets, but the fish that is alive and in the water has an economic value as well. But that value typically does not have a market price. That value can be computed, determined, for example, by means of ecological economic modeling, but it remains a shadow price if there is no market for it. And this means that in market terms, the natural capital asset, that is the stock of fish that are alive and in the water, that is undervalued. So there's kind of a discrepancy that the fish has a value both live and when it is caught and brought to the market, but only the dead fish, so to speak, has a market value. The fish that is alive only has a shadow value, a shadow price that is not typically adequately taken into account by the fishermen, and then we see this problem of overfishing arising. Now, from economic point of view, how can this be? How can this situation be improved? Well, in principle, it's conceivable that fish that is alive and in the water also receives a market value. How? Well, in a sense, the right to turn a fish from alive and in the ocean into one that is harvested, this right or the license or permissions, as you might call it, this can be officially declared and made tradable. The corresponding economic instrument is called a catch share, in which the individual fishers gets the right to catch a certain fraction of the total allowable catch that is set for the particular fish stock under consideration, and that right is transferable, and so a market establishes for this right, and this is a surrogate for the surrogate market price for the fish that is alive and in the water. The value can be observed on the market and has been continuously increasing, and it has crossed. It is now about 2 billion euros, so quite a substantial value. Now, this type of governance instrument has also biological consequences, and that is measured here in terms of the fish stock collapses. So generally, we see that due to overfishing, fisheries, fish stocks have been collapsing in the past. And the point I wanted to make here is that the introduction of such a governance system, catch share system, also causally makes the fishery more resilient against the collapse, and that is shown here in the picture on the right. It is the years relative to the year of implementing this catch share program. That's the effect on the probability of collapse, and you see that after the introduction of the catch share program, this probability collapses and is significantly lower compared to fisheries without that system after a few decades after the introduction. And that shows two things. One, it's ecologically helpful to have this system in place, but the other thing shows it takes time until this materializes. And that means that it takes time until the benefits realize, means that the resource users need to be patient also until the economic returns of such an instrument realize. And if resource users are too short-sighted in economic terms, if their discount rate is too high, then taking into consideration this period of time that it requires until the benefits are realized, this leads to the implication that for some resource users, the introduction of such a system may actually be worse than keeping the fishery in an open access situation. That is what this slide shows. And I think before I'm kicked out again, I would like to briefly wrap up and hope that you, despite these technical difficulties, got the key messages. The first two, I think you have been seeing. The point that fishes catch share, they are good in economic terms. They create a lot of economic value. They also cause fisheries to be more resilient against fish stock collapse. That hopefully you have seen on the graphs on the slides. And one of the challenges, because it takes, in particular, because it takes time until those benefits in ecological and economic terms realize, it's difficult to achieve a fair distribution of benefits. Then hopefully I will stay online for the discussion if there is need.
Thank you so much, dear Martin, and sorry for these technical problems. I do not know what happened. Maybe since you were broken, we should still have time for one question. There was one in the chat from Holger Papst. He tells that you show that the catch shares reduced fish stock collapse, but after some years, the collapses are back. So maybe you can respond shortly to this question. Can you see it?
I can see the question, but I don't see that conclusion. The collapses are back. We're talking about this slide. If you look at the picture here on the left, you see that introducing catch shares does not fully ensure a stock against collapse. So there are also fish stocks that are managed by catch shares and that still collapse. The point is that ultimately what matters for the fish is the total allowable catches, and also under catch share program, those total allowable catches are determined by the regulator, and sometimes they're simply set too generous. But the key message is that if you compare without and with catch shares, then we see a significant difference, and the graph on the right shows us that this difference becomes significant a few decades after the introduction of such a catch share system.
Okay, thank you so much. I would suggest that all those who have still questions keep them in mind so that we can continue. And I'm now overhanding to Tobias for introducing the second talk.
Right, so our next talk, thank you very much, Professor Quaas. Our next talk will be Professor Dr. Ina Theesfeld from on tipping points in the governance subsystem. And Professor Theesfeld is Professor in Agricultural, Environmental and Food Policy and Resource Governance at the Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg. And she's an agricultural and institutional economist, and a significant strand of her work explores governance of shared natural resources, including the provision of global commons, such as biodiversity. And she also serves as the president of the International Association for the Study of the Commons. So please, Professor Theesfeld.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good. Yeah, what I'd like to highlight a little bit a different perspective today, and let me give you also some examples what I understand by modeling on tipping points in the governance subsystem. First of all, and concentrating more on agricultural systems, ecological systems. These currently face the challenge of course, providing food and more also energy, and at the same time mitigate the severe negative consequences and impacts from certain forms of that land use, such as biodiversity loss. So to address the complexity of this agri-ecological systems and biodiversity provision, knowledge from different disciplines need to be considered. I think that's not something we consider as a new aspect. Yet we often fail to consider the complex interrelationships and dynamics of the different subsystems in which land use change or agricultural practices happen that lead to biodiversity loss. And there are two important aspects that add further complexity to the study of such systems. And first, we have various natural economics and governance subsystems, and they are linked via feedback loops. And second, marginal alternations in the subsystems frequently drive the system towards a tipping point after which the system changes rapidly. So let us dig a little bit deeper in what I want to express with that. If we want to follow a more holistic view on biodiversity, and I think that's what we're also aiming at this conference, it requires to consider the governance structures not only as an input to the system, meaning some kinds of economic or regulatory or voluntary based instruments and what happens if we're going to apply them. Governance structures should not only be understood so as an independent external driver to the provision of biodiversity services. Considering the highly linkages between these different systems, they are really bridged in various directions. So governance itself can also be modeled as a subsystem. In that respect, the paper, I think, or the presentation takes a little bit a different perspective. So I do not discuss the state and effectiveness of existing governance approaches or added values for more coherent, smart policy and governance mixes and open questions considering the future design or operationalization of a holistic biodiversity governance. I rather move the governance itself in the center of the attention. So maybe just very shortly, what kind of understanding I have concerning governance. So it's, and particularly environmental governance, which includes the full range of regulatory processes, social mechanisms, and organizations through which political actors influence environmental actions and outcomes. But it's not only state actors that play a considerable role, also non-state actors, power and mechanisms regulate, manage, and steer social collective action, and that has to be considered as well. So we have all these formal and informal ways of supporting or supervising actors or even sanctioning them, like information sharing, knowledge sharing mechanisms, monitoring, conflict resolutions, but also the economic instruments we just heard about. Let me go one step further to show you in general what I understand by tipping points in the governance structure. So a tipping point happens when a system crosses a threshold behavior where at the same point incremental changes cause a change in the state of the system with limited reversibility. Tipping points refer to changes in natural systems, but, and I think that's what I would like to highlight, also to social systems with their governance structures. They can also reach tipping points, passing a threshold that leads to a new governance structure to manage that natural resource. Let me give you one example, what I understand here by that. So if there's a public concern, for instance, how pesticides harm biodiversity, the environmental impact of a pesticide can reach such a high level of political relevance that the pesticide is banned. So it has either short-term toxic effects on directly exposed organisms, or long-term effects can result from changes to habitats on the food chain. So what happens then if I once ban these pesticides? That's very hard to change afterwards. So even if it turns out that the pesticides has less harmful effects than initially thought, due to past dependence and bureaucratic inertia, it's de facto irreversible. Let's look at feedback loops in governance structures. So feedback loops describe situations in which a change in a subsystem causes a change in a different subsystem. However, this change triggers a reaction back to the original subsystem, and thus a feedback loop emerges. And you can also do that via social or governance subsystems. Let's assume we have unsustainable cropping practices in the economic subsystem, which leads to soil compaction in the natural subsystem, which in turn reduces the option for productive use again. So there's the feedback loop. In principle, it should be possible to develop models that integrate knowledge from these fields of ecology, economics, and governance, and consider these dynamic system features such as feedback loops between the different systems and tipping points. What we try to do in a consortium, in a little project we have done, is we try to screen the literature, or as far as we were aware of those agri-ecological system models that try to follow this integrated view, and we could only find a few models that comprehensively address these challenges, and we also raised some limitations or what's so tricky about integrating those in this paper. To give you some results or ideas out of that, so let's go again to the example of tipping point in the aspect of nitrogen release. There are two types of tipping points. One is from a governance perspective, if water can no longer be used as drinking water due to the violation of the maximum threshold value of nitrate. From an ecological perspective, if agri-ecological systems lose their sustainability as a habitat for specific species and providers of ecosystem services due to eutrophication, in areas that are particularly vulnerable to nitrogen inputs. So here you see the different idea of what a tipping point could be, looking at it from an ecological or from a governance perspective. And if we have a look at an example, I don't see my headline anymore. You maybe also not. So the headline is Example Feedback Loops, Regulation to Reduce Nitrogen. So trying to find feedback loops in a similar story here about nitrogen, reduction of nitrogen emissions. So the regulation could be to curb nitrogen emissions accompanied by comprehensive and intensive documentation duties. I think we can all envision ourselves such a regulation. So the feedback of the farming system could be either an intended consequence. Farms have to cut down their intensive production measure. But at the same time, it could also have unintended consequences. Like if you assume the cost for the new documentation and the duties and the time, also for farms with really low profitability working on extensive use of marginal lands. So this might be just enough to push them out of business, meaning reducing extensive land use and the further abandonment of marginal farmland, which then, of course, is a loss in extensively managed farmland, which on the other hand is actually that land use which is very valuable for biodiversity. So we have here a negative feedback loop. Yeah, that was just some thoughts with examples what we actually try to grasp here. So let me sum up a little bit. I assume you also don't see the upper part of my slide here, or I don't know. No, you see it fully? Okay, good. So to conclude, in order to make scientifically better targeted predictions and also steer biodiversity protection, we need to include the governance subsystems more in an integrated mode, not only as an input to complex systems. If we also want to try to measure the effectiveness and the impact of existing governance approaches in terms of providing more biodiversity services, so far this has been rather one-dimensional. But we could use the governance subsystem itself, has to be treated as a more dynamic outcome, same as economic and ecological systems are also done. So there are certain points we need further work on and to think about. The ecological systems are highly complex and their analysis requires integration of diverse disciplines. Integrated models may be useful for this purpose, but they should include tipping points and feedback loops, both applying to the governance and not only to the ecological system. So integrating governance can make model predictions more accurate. Thank you for your attendance and listening to me.
Okay, thank you, dear Insa. At the moment, I don't see urgent questions in the chat. So those who have questions on this presentations, I ask you kindly to keep them in mind. We will still have some time for discussion, for questions to the single presentations. Thank you so much. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the third talk, Tobias Schulz. Those who attended the introduction already know him. He's since 2007 senior scientist at the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow and Landscape Research, and he's working on the implementation of agriculture, forest and nature conservation policies and spatial planning. Originally, he studied economics at the University of St. Gallen and did his dissertation on ballot voting on environmental policy issues in Switzerland and in California. So a very nice comparison. And then he worked as a political scientist at the universities of St. Gallen and Zurich, and was also visiting scholar at the University of California and San Diego. So Tobias, it's nice that you were joining our session, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Christine, for this nice introduction. I hope you can see my shared screen. Is this okay? Okay. So today I will focus on forest biodiversity. That's what I worked on in recent years mostly. And it's the title is Success and Failure in Forest Biodiversity Conservation Governance. I will maybe point to some failures and also highlight some successes. Not always clear whether the connection is that close, and of course it's also not always based on a very scientific evaluation of those governance aspects. However, what we tried once is to outline like the governance system for forest biodiversity. As you can see, we have 3 policies involved, of course, forest policy, but then also nature conservation policy and also agricultural policy to some extent. The point here is, I want to make here is that forest biodiversity governance is fragmented to some extent. We have like goal systems from very like strong nature conservation policy, if I may say, but particularly at the EU level, we have the EU biodiversity strategy and in particular the habitats and bird directives. Those are rather strong regulations that have to be implemented at national levels. And then at the forest side, the governance is not that strong. So a strict EU forest policy is kind of missing still, and the forest policies are mostly not even at the national level that strong, but mostly at the subnational level, right? So this is an important thing to remember if we talk about forest biodiversity governance. And it's now all about how this, how we deal with this structure and how we make the best of it by introducing governance approaches that can take advantage of those structures, and how we learn about that. Well, usually the term governance is used to indicate new and superior steering approaches that improve on previous failures. I will maybe point to some of those failures, but it's not that. It's not at the center of my talk. And what we talk about with respect to forest biodiversity mostly is like the differentiation between 2 strategy, I'd say, like more the segregated strategy, which is about introducing forest reserves, right, and taking out forest, taking it away from human intervention, and then the more integrated way of forest biodiversity, which means to implement some structures in the forest of later succession stages or earlier succession stages in the forest that are not that common anymore in the modern production forest, right? Which aims at building up single strong trees at a certain time, and then they will be removed, and we will have the same going over and over. So we have those elements, right? Deadwood, rare forest types, old growth islands. Those are the measures we usually talk about if we talk about forest biodiversity conservation. So this all has to be implemented somehow on the ground. And here, what comes in here is also a certain amount of planning, right? So the forest planning and conservation site planning are then important elements at the implementation stage. What we saw before is more the goal setting stage, and then at the implementation stage, this is at the regional, local level, where we try to introduce those elements like deadwoods, habitat trees, old growth islands, special reserves in the forest. There has been some problems, I'd say, with like what I called the strict governance approach. Was more like a traditional governance approach. We have these EU directives, we implement them in national laws, and then we identify protected areas, and we just do this in a more hierarchical way, which has caused much distrust and trouble and negative reactions from the affected then addressees at the ground, right? So let's say this was more like the traditional, the top-down governance approach, and a more modern approach would probably be to have this implemented in a more participative bottom-up approach, right? So what could that mean? We do have an example maybe in Switzerland, which could be labeled more like a concerted governance approach. So we are still in the realm of government, not so much governance, but it is going into a different direction already, right? So what we have in Switzerland is the national level that has some, and we are not connected in any way to the Natura 2000 program. That's now a very different thing in Switzerland, right? Its own Swiss program. And we have a national level that is able to actually set some goals, right? And this is because it is built on the national equalization program, financial equalization program, that between the cantons, so some cantons have to pay other cantons because they are poor, and the whole budget, this is earmarked for some political programs, and one of those is forest biodiversity. And then, because we have implemented it with this equalization program, the national level has some say in what should be done with that money. And it has the possibilities to set goals at the national level. And then there will be negotiations with the cantons, which come up with budgets and instruments, ideas about how this could be implemented. And there will be negotiations between the national level and the canton level about whether we should really have this goal or that goal, and this measure and that measure. So it's more a concerted government's approach, I'd say, and there's literature about this type of governance approach, right? So what you can say here in the chart is actually the goal setting at the national level, which then can also be, because we have a little bit more oversight at the national level, can be more spatially differentiated, geographically differentiated, which is a huge advantage with respect to biodiversity conservation measures and goal setting and implementation. So this is something I would highlight as a maybe new governance approach from Switzerland that might be interesting also in other federal contexts. And this integrated and segregated approach has actually, so that the habitats directive implementation at the national level has also provoked to somehow more integrative concepts which have been developed, particularly in Germany, also together with the state forests. So we have seen that it's not always the same history, but we have seen popping up state forest biodiversity concepts over the last 20 years, also initiated by this regulatory pressure from the top. Here, the point is that implementing those measures in the state forest might be something that is rather not that complicated. You can have ambitions, and you can have like instruments very differentiated, and the foresters at some points they would have to implement it more or less like it is designed in those strategies. But then for the private forest, it's much more complicated. And here in forestry is not a very innovative sector, so we have so many new economic instruments as they had been introduced at the previous talk. So it's mostly about subsidies, giving incentives to forest owners to implement some of those elements in the forests. And here the point is that foresters are very distrustful with respect to if somebody knows about some element in the forest that is interesting, at some point the state will come and will grab it, right? So they are very reluctant to participate in those programs, And also it's about money. So mostly it's not enough incentive for them. And the question is always how ambitious should those programs be and how flexible should be the implementation. So should we have longer contracts or shorter contracts and much compensation and less compensation. So we've looked at those different programs in different subnational systems, and we have seen that there seems to be a trade-off, sorry for using that word, a trade-off between the temporal flexibility is mostly the length of the current contracts and the ambition we want to have with those rules, right? So we have, like at one extreme, we have Switzerland and Baden-Württemberg, which seem to be rather ambitious and do not want to have short contracts, but tend to really also implement that in a rigorous way, whereas at the other end there's Bavaria and Austria, which have a different strategy, right? They are not so high in ambition and they offer short contracts. And the strategy behind is to mobilize forest owners to enter those programs and to participate, and then at some point to stay in there and to have more and more over time, so that this would be successful more from a bottom-up perspective and not so much top-down hierarchical strict. So those different strategy, they mostly also hinge very much on the forest owner structure. We must see. So Bavaria and Austria are contexts with a high share of private forest owners. Switzerland and Baden-Württemberg are contexts with a high share of municipality forest, right? And maybe, but that's something to look more into, it's easier to implement stricter concepts in a municipality forest context. So the last point I'd like to make is if we go even more on the ground, looking at different professional groups doing decisions in the forest, we can see that there are differences. So foresters are trained to do trade-offs between economic income and ecological effects, right? So as you can see here in the graphs, we had a stand with mostly oak and some hornbeam, and in the search of habitat trees, the nature conservationists, they solely chose oak because that's the tree for biodiversity, right? And those were large oaks. And the foresters, they couldn't do that because they would have sacrificed some income, so they also chose smaller hornbeams. Now, the justification was that hornbeams, they will be the future habitat trees. They're small now, but we have to look ahead, right? But then if we have those kind of justifications, we also need some concepts that are built into silvicultural concepts that guide foresters and that will be probably developed together with nature conservationists in a more cooperative manner in the future. That would be advisable. Now there's another last point, and what we have identified in another context built on a book collecting many examples from all over Europe is that what we probably would need in the future is a more landscape perspective that tries to come away from an integrated forest management conception that only that tries to implement integrated forest management for each forest stand separately. So we have to have all the functions within one forest stand, but to coordinate them more over a landscape, to have coordination mechanism between forest owners and forest enterprises and forest users, and to come to landscape-based systems of compensation and planning that would be make it more feasible to implement such a picture as you can see here. Right, thanks for your attention. I hope I haven't gone over the limit too much.
No, I think it's still okay, but I would suggest that we move the detailed questions to the discussion later, to enable also the next speaker whom I'd like you to introduce, Marion Mehring, to present her approaches. Now I hope I can show it. So please, Tobias, can you introduce
Yes,
Marion?
of course. Now the next speaker will be Marion Mehring. She's head of research at Unit Biodiversity and People at ISOE, the Institute for Social-Ecological Research in Frankfurt am Main, since 2014. And she is a geoecologist and holds a PhD in human geography from University of Greifswald. And on the topic of management effectiveness of buffer zones in biosphere reserves. And since then, Marion has been working in the fields of social ecological biodiversity research on the topics of perception and valuation of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and as well as behavioral change and transformative change. And she has now more than 10 years of experience working in inter- and transdisciplinary top projects. So please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tobias and Christine, for the kind introduction. I will share my screen now in order to show my slides. So, and you should see my slides now in the presentation mode. Yeah, so the title of my talk today is Transformative Governance Instruments, the Acceptance from Agriculture and Forestry, a case study from Germany. And while listening to your presentation, Tobias, I think my talk is quite a good kind of follow-up of some parts that you have already presented, because with my presentation, I will now give a voice to the farmers and also to the foresters, and I will show some empirical insights from a case study that we have done in Germany on the topic of the acceptance of transformative measures. And the project I will present today, this was done in collaboration with and also funded by FEDA. So regarding the background, what is the starting point of the project that we have set up? As we have heard in the previous 2 days, biodiversity is declining tremendously, and especially in agricultural landscapes. And this was also stated in the two reports from the Leopoldina for Germany that you can see on the upper right here. So, and yeah, all of us know that the agriculture and also the forestry, on the one hand, they are the largest land users, and at the same time, or this also makes them a key actors for a social ecological transformation. So on the one hand, both sectors are responsible for the biodiversity dynamics or the biodiversity loss in Germany, and at the same time they are also affected by these biodiversity loss. Yeah, and this was one of the reasons why we were interested in our study to get a deeper insight, so how these two actor groups, agriculture and forestry, how they actually do perceive the situation of biodiversity loss in Germany, and to what extent are they willing to change their behavior to contribute something to stop the biodiversity loss. And with this citation, I would like to give some insights what were the kind of starting point of our work. So this is a citation from Yves Zingrebe in the Leopoldina state report, and it says that the administrative burden and complex legal frameworks of agri-environmental measures hinder many farmers and ultimately lead to them having little effect on biodiversity conservation. So this is where we would, or where we focused on or started with our project, and looking at what are actually the motives. Why do people from the agriculture or forestry sector do implement biodiversity conservation measures, and what are actually barriers? With this slide, I present our conceptual framework that we have implemented in our project. So the main focus of our research was the acceptance of these transformative practices in order to conserve biodiversity. And here it is relevant for us, or what we have, the data that we collected was on the one hand on the attitudes towards these biodiversity conservation measures, and we also did a sub-survey on the attitudes or evaluation of the different instruments like the regulatory, communicative, incentive, or voluntary commitment. The acceptance of these transformative practices, from our understanding, is influenced by the different motives or barriers that might exist within the two different actor groups. And these motives and barriers, at the same time, from our understanding, are related to biodiversity awareness. And regarding the biodiversity or the conceptualization of biodiversity awareness, we draw from our expertise from the environmental awareness studies that is regularly done in Germany. And here the three different dimensions of the cognitive, affective, and conative dimension are distinguished. The cognitive dimension means this is everything related to what extent are the people aware of the problem? Is there a shared problem understanding? The affective dimension means this is the emotional involvement with the respective problem. And the conative dimension is to what extent are the people or the actors do see a need for action, and are they willing to contribute something or to change their behavior. And in addition to that, the general relation to nature, so how do I conceive nature, also is an influencing factor for the motives and barriers, and thus in a final step of the acceptance of transformative practices. So implementing this conceptual framework in our project, we conducted a quantitative survey in Germany via telephone and online with 500 farmers and also with 500 foresters. And for the foresters, we included forest managers and also the private forest owners. And from your presentation, Tobias, we already heard that these two groups, the private forest owners, but also the forest managers, there are two important subgroups within this actor group of forestry. And with my presentation today, I will mainly focus on the motives and barriers, and will show you the results of our survey. And this slide is a kind of introductory to the topics of the motives and barriers. For example, here we asked the interview partners from their opinion if there is enough being done in Germany to protect biodiversity. In green, you can see the answers for the agriculture. In purple, you can see the answers for the forestry. And you can see here that the large majority finds that not enough is being done to protect biodiversity in Germany, especially within the agricultural sector. When asking the interview partners about who should do more to protect biodiversity, we get a quite interesting picture. So we can see here that almost, or that except the group of the nature conservation and environmental associations, all the different groups should do more. And what is also interesting here, that both groups, both from the agriculture and the forestry, they see that their own peer group actually should do more to protect biodiversity. So the agriculture says about themselves, with a majority of 63%, that agriculture should do more, and the same is true for forestry. A third interesting point here is the role of the food retail sectors or the consumer. And I think this links a little bit to what we have heard and discussed yesterday in some of the sessions, that the food producers and retail sectors and also the consumers are seen as a relevant group here in order to do more to protect biodiversity. And then when asking our interview partners, would you actually like to do more to protect biodiversity? We had a surprisingly high approval of rating or consent. So 90% from the forestry sector and 67% from the agricultural sector said yes. And when looking into these two groups who didn't agree with these statements, these were especially those people who also stated that they were within their business or within their forest, that they were not affected by the loss of biodiversity. And this brings us then now to the question, what actually are the motives for implementing biodiversity measures? And here is the slide for the group of the agriculture. And we in our survey, we made statements, so-called items that you can see on the left-hand side here, and ask the interview partners to what extent they agree or disagree. And in green, you can see the level of agreement. And on the right side, you can see the mean value, and the higher the value, the higher the agreement to the statement. So what was striking here for the group of the agriculture is that especially or significantly the intrinsic motivation, because I want to make a contribution, this was significantly rated at the highest, while the two items that were more related to the economic motives, they were rated as to be the least relevant. And a kind of similar pattern appears when we look at the answers for the forestry. So the highest agreement here was also to the to the statement, I implement measures for biodiversity conservation because I want to make a contribution. With my next slide, I will now continue with the challenges. And here we used a similar methodology, having these items and asking the interview partners to rate them or to stay their agreement or disagreement. And due to time reasons, I will now show only the items with the highest and the lowest agreements from the two sector groups of agriculture and forestry. And what we can see here regarding the challenges, that the main challenges that were rated as the highest, having the highest relevance, are related to the implementation of the respective measures, such as, for example, the lack of flexibility of the measures, or the documentation effort is too high, or that the application effort of the respective measures are the application effort to implement the respective measures are too high. What were rated with the lowest value was interestingly given to the item that they do seeing that there is a lack of ecological effectiveness of the measures. And this shows us in a general picture, or one assumption of these challenges then could be that the main challenges that both agriculture and forestry see for implementing biodiversity measures are not so much a lack of a meaningfulness of the measure, but it's more a problem of the implementation of the respective measures. This is my last slide regarding the content of my presentation, and this is on the barriers for not implementing biodiversity measures. So here we ask only those people, those interview partners who stated that they do not implement biodiversity measures in their field. And in general, this was only a minority of our survey. So only 7% out of the 500 stated that they do not implement measures. And the main barriers why they do not implement measures were mainly economic, fears or feasibility aspects. So a little bit similar to what we saw for the challenges that, for example, a lack of human resources or this high application effort, especially in the forestry sector and regarding the agriculture, the lack of flexibility of the measures, or that they see that it's not profitable due to the high land and leasing prices, or they do not see that it's economically attractive. And similar to those who implemented measures, the lack of ecological effectiveness was valued as least relevant, together with the item that they see no necessity to further protect biodiversity. So summing up, we can say regarding the barriers, the main barriers from our results are not a lack of problem understanding in the two actor groups, but rather of feasibility and economic aspects. So the main conclusions out of our study are, on the one hand, that from our study we can say the problem is not a lack of awareness or motivation, but maybe rather a problem in implementing measures for protecting biodiversity. Regarding the motives, we can say those who already implement measures, they do it because they really want to make a contribution. So this intrinsic motivation to act ecologically was high in both actor groups and really made a significant contribution. Regarding the barriers, we can say for those who do not implement measures, the problem is not so much a lack of understanding of the necessity or the meaningfulness of the different measures, but rather a concern about the lack of the economic efficiency. And I think the results, especially regarding the motives and barriers, this already gives a little bit of idea how to approach these two actor groups, and maybe also how to either further motivate or to support them in even doing more. And regarding the group who is not implementing measure, this gives us some hints how to maybe further convince them. Yeah, and with this, I am finished with my presentation, and I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you to Marion. And as you can see from the chat already, there are some interests in your study. And one is, of course, what's the title of the project and is it already published? So maybe we can start the discussion with these two questions.
Yeah, the title of the project is Visions for Biodiversity, or in German Zielvorstellung Biodiversität. And as I said, it was funded and in collaboration with FEDA. And the data or the results are not yet published. We are now in the final stage of the analysis, and together with FEDA, we are currently discussing and thinking about how to publish, to make a report, or how to also communicate to a broader audience. The project will finish early next year.
Thank you so much. So now it's time for questions and discussion. And I saw already in the chat the comment, you can either use the chat or you can also raise your hand. This is the third button on the left side from the top. Usually I should then get a message that you want to comment on something. My suggestion is let's take 10 minutes to answer questions that are addressing the single presentations. I saw there was one, for instance, from Stefan Knaus related to Martin Quaas' presentation before. Sorry that I suggested to move, but Stefan, maybe I can come back to you. The question was, how is the shadow price measured if not by a market price? So that's going toward you, Martin.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot. The challenge for the shadow price is that there is no direct way of measuring the shadow price. Yeah, this is really the difference from the market price. The market price we can observe, and that is in a sense tangible, right? And this is why it was also guiding both private decisions, but also to a large extent, I think, policy making. The shadow price needs to be somehow estimated. And this is where also science and scientific methods come into play. So we tend to use non-market valuation methods, for example, to estimate benefits that forests and land-based biodiversity provide for people in terms of recreational benefits, cultural services, and the like. And then we use models to compute the shadow price for natural capital assets. That's something, for example, when it comes to the fishery, the value of and the shadow price of a fish that is alive and in the water, that needs to be estimated and computed. Then it can be turned into something like a market price under an appropriate governance structure. And one such way of implementing a governance structure that turns shadow prices into actual market prices are the catch shares in the fisheries that I've presented. The catch share, if you want, is a surrogate for a market of fish that is alive, because this catch share or such a quota gives a permit to a fisher to turn a fish that is alive into marketable fish that is harvested. And if those quotas are exchangeable, the market price for these licenses is a surrogate for the shadow price. And it reflects then the scarcity of stock that comes about due to the regulation.
Okay, thank you so much. Stefan, are you fine with the response, or is this still... Okay, thank you. Are there other questions related to the presentations? So I'm looking at the raise hand and chat function. Okay, Insa has a question, I see, but I cannot activate you. I only see lower hand. Maybe the technical team can help me.
I don't know. Should I just ask my question?
Yeah.
Okay, I would like to hear a little bit more, Tobias, about the what you called concerted governments or government, this form of governance. So can you explain in short, I mean, how much bottom-up details or input does that have, and how much top-down, or how would you frame that again shortly? So how is that similar more, because it's a new term, so why does it not fit into other terms like adaptive governance or collaborative governance or collective action? What is particular about this one?
Well, you know, there's probably a huge offer of concepts with respect to governance approaches, and it probably depends a bit from where you're coming. I have chosen the term because it was put forward by a colleague of mine who has worked on governance typology. And the good thing what I liked about it was that he's not so much differentiating between the old government and then all the new governance approaches, but he also tried to differentiate a little bit more within the government realm, that there can be different approaches and more modern approaches, which are not so much governance in the sense that they do not rely very much on external private partners and delegate decisions, maybe also to stakeholders and all that, but it's still something that is how government agencies are coordinating. And maybe the more traditional perspective is that we have an integrated central government, right? If you start from that perspective, which is maybe really rather old perspective, and then a more modern view would be that we have, in the meantime, very functionally differentiated, but then maybe also spatially differentiated government subsystems, if you might call them, that need to be coordinated somehow, right? So it's not something very hierarchical, but we need a different coordination mode, and which could then also be more successful than just only top-down hierarchically implement goals that have been decided somewhere at the top and have to be implemented at a lower stage, a lower level. And this concerted government perspective highlights that government agencies might be coordinated not only through hierarchical relations, but also through negotiation and contracts, actually. So in Switzerland, what we have are contracts between the national and the subnational level for 4 years that are negotiated, and that will then be have this certain timeline, right, for 4 years, and that are, it's not so clear from the beginning where this negotiation will end up. So it's more flexible and not so much hierarchical as a coordination mode. That's the only thing I wanted to mention. Whether you call it concerted government or something else depends on where you come from and what kind of governance approach you probably, or the theoretical governance approach you're following.
Okay, thanks.
Is that sufficient as an answer?
Thank you so much, Tobias. So I saw we have 2 questions now to Marion. Martin, I didn't oversee your one, but I think it would make sense to combine. So one is from Greta Theilen. How far, Marion, did you classify the respondents? Or was it possible to see any background aspects from the respondents? And the second question related to your presentation was from Julian Quandt, who was impressed by your presentation and wanted to ask if the results are only valid for Germany, agriculture and forestry, or if these can be transferred.
Yeah, thank you very much for the 2 questions. I will start with the second question. Our results are only valid for Germany. So the data collection was for Germany, and especially for the forestry, the case that we also integrated private forest owners. This is quite novel also for Germany, because this group of the private forest owners, there is really only a few study and really understanding of this group. And as Tobias Schulz, I think you also mentioned it, yeah, that for Germany, that the group of the private forest owners, they are quite important group, because half of the forest in Germany is managed by the private forest owners. So from this part, we expect from our study also really new insights to get a better understanding of this group. Regarding the first question, to what extent we see differences between different subgroups or also socio-demographic aspects in our study, I could say for the group of agriculture, what we would have expected maybe that we could see differences between the organic and the conventional farming. And so far, it looks like from our analysis that there are no differences or no huge differences between the organic and conventional farming, but that rather the aspect to what extent the interview partners see that they are affected in their doing by biodiversity, that this aspect explains better the diversity within the group, especially for the agriculture. And for the forestry, I could say that that there are differences, for example, when looking into the group of the forest managers, but also and distinguish it from the private forest owners. And for example, the challenges that I presented, that especially this high application effort or the fear of having less income, or also the to see or question the ecological effectiveness of the different measures. These were mainly challenges and also barriers that were raised by the group of the forest managers. Yeah, this is maybe how I can summarize it in short. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Marion. So I want to overhand then the next question to Martin by Birte Hauser, coming back to the fish share. So maybe you can explain.
I don't have the question because I was in between. I was also kicked out, so and then I cannot read the chat from before.
Okay, so Birte Hauser is asking, don't fishermen have to include fish share in the market price to pay for it?
Oh yes, absolutely. That is how it should be. It's true that if you look at the supply price for fish, then economically speaking, one can disentangle this into two parts, potentially three, but let's focus on two. One is the effort and the cost of catching and landing the fish. The remuneration for the vessel, for the fisher, fuel and the like. And the other part is the cost of the right to catch the fish. And only in a catch share fishery, the second part actually exists. In a fishery that is regulated otherwise or unregulated, it's only the cost of the actual cost of fishing. And then, of course, in the market price, this means that with catch shares, the cost of reducing the natural capital stock is included, and without without catch shares, this is not the case. And this has consequences, because the consumers actually have to pay more if there are catch shares at any given fish stock size. So if you want, in a short run, introducing catch shares is bad for the consumers. They would prefer to have the cheaper fish, where the costs of diminishing the natural capital asset are not included. In the long term, if catch shares, we have seen this tend to lead to a more sustainable management of the fish stocks, and more sustainable also means more productive in the long term. And then this is good for the consumers, because then more fish is on the market, which would decrease the market price. But in the short term, it's bad for consumers. It's also, in a sense, if you want, bad for fishers, because they have to pay for something, or at least, they have to pay for something, namely the right to catch a fish, for which they don't have to pay in an open access situation. I think it's a very important point to keep in mind, and this is a challenge for putting natural capital into market value, because the users have to pay for something that they would not have to pay if this is for free.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up question by Stefan Knaus. There are different governance regimes to internalize externalities. Can you compare the fish market model to the CO2 trade in the climate regime? And he's advocating a direct juridical protection of ecosystems by the rights of nature.
Yes, in a sense, the European Union emissions trading system for greenhouse gas emissions is very similar to a catch share program in fisheries. So there are differences here and there, but by and large, the idea of a tradable permit system for greenhouse gas emissions is also the idea that this natural capital asset, the intact climate, should also receive a market price in order to reflect this the value of this natural capital asset in economic decision making. So in a sense, it's very similar approach. The other part of the question is to say that one should, or could you just give the formulation again, please?
Yes, he was advocating a direct juridical protection of ecosystems by this concept of rights of nature. So what's your opinion towards that?
Yes, yes. So for protecting juridical or not, right? We're talking this how to name that approach. I think this is a different question. But the key part to me is that the emphasis on the right of nature as a reason to conserve natural capital and biodiversity. This is, I think, something that is beyond doubt, that this is a reason for conserving nature. As you probably are aware, that the intrinsic value of nature, so the rights of nature, feature prominently in the preamble of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So I think one cannot, one cannot put this really into doubt. So I fully agree, and that means of course that conservation that is due to intrinsic rights of natural entities should not be tradable in markets, and then of course something like catch shares or emission permits simply do not apply, I would say. But it's, I think, not clear that an individual fish has the intrinsic right to not to be harvested, right? I think this is not where we are. I do think that considerations of food security but also market values of fish, they in that regard they still play an important role. When it comes to forests, I would think that at least for some old growth forest, one may introduce such considerations and say that they should simply not be harvested, because we feel that they should be there, for example, for intrinsic rights. Yeah, I think that's conceivable.
Okay, thank you. So we have a final question by Irene Ring to Marion, a clarification of what you exactly mean by transformative.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Irene, for this question. So with our study, in addition to what I presented on the motives and barriers for implementing biodiversity measures, we also collected data on the attitudes towards different existing instruments regarding the regulatory, communicative incentive, and also the voluntary commitment. But due to time reasons, I didn't present it in my presentation here. And the results clearly showed that especially the regulatory instruments, they are not favored by both groups, from agriculture and forestry. And with transformative, I meant that we had another section or part in our project where we ask the interview partners to give their agreement or willingness to implement current new transformative practices that are currently discussed for the both sectors, for agriculture and for forestry. And for agriculture here, we integrated measures that were developed from the Zukunftskommission Landwirtschaft, from the Future Commission for Agriculture, and for the forestry sector, we integrated measures that are currently discussed in the Waldbericht, in the forestry report. And also due to the time reason, I didn't present it today, but what was interesting, especially for the forestry, I would like to mention now, because it links to the presentation from you, Tobias, that we really saw a clear picture that these more integrated approaches, like integrating heterogeneity within the management of the forest, or deadwood, or changing the type of management towards a more ecosystem-based or ecosystem conservation-based approach. These kind of measures are clearly preferred, significantly clearly preferred by the group of forestry, while the measures that are more related to these top-down approaches, implementing new conservation areas or things like that, they are really denied by this group. And I think this fits very well to what you also presented. Yeah,
it's very plausible.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm convinced there would be much more questions and much more demand for discussion, but our time slot is now running out. I think what we learned is that implementation is one of the key problems in a better conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. We learned it's often a multi-level governance thing. We learned that particularly the dynamics of the social system should be better included. And we learned that market prices are not always the key to solve anything. So to sum it up very shortly and then overhand back to the lobby where the next section is waiting for you. I think what we could see from the discussion, from the presentations, is that governance is a key and is a door opener for biodiversity futures. I thank you all warmly for the wonderful presentations, for the nice and lively discussion. We have summarized up some more key messages that were overhanded to the coordination. I hope they can be included in their papers. So let me say thank you again. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the conference and see you next time. Goodbye.